As always, this will be an edited podcast on all your favorite platforms under that Lead Lag Live banner on Spotify, Apple. And by the way, on a side note, if any of you can do me a favor, please review Lead Lag Live on those various platforms, given that I do this totally on my own. Any help is always appreciated. My name is Michael Guyad, publisher of the Lead Lag Report. Joining me for the hour is Mr. BF Randall, who's got the phenomenal handle Mining Atoms. BF, you and I have been back and forth a bit on DM. I don't know that much about you, but I know a lot of smart people follow you. Introduce yourself. Who are you? What do you do? And how'd you get so involved in the energy and natural resource space?
Well, that's a good introduction. Well, let me just kind of explain a little bit about me then. So I've been practicing law for almost full time for almost 30 years, and I am not in the investment world. I do not have a business acumen in terms of the investment markets. There's a lot of things that I'm not. I'm not an author. I'm not selling any products. I'm not connected to markets. I don't represent any interest directly or indirectly. I have no personal investments in spaces. But that being said, I do have a broad-based experience in industry, in the mining industry, in the petroleum industry, in the energy markets, in the utility industry, from many, many different angles. I worked for one of the world's largest energy and utility law firms for many years. I worked for a bond firm. We did a lot of bond finance for energy projects. So I have a lot of that kind of experience, and I work a lot with the engineers and the scientists and the technical side of industry, because when I have to translate that for a lay audience in a legal world, that's just been my job for 30 years. So I joined Twitter in March, and the more I got looking at, I've never been on Twitter before, but the more I got looking at it, I started commenting on, energy topics and natural resource topics, because so much of what's happening to me is just an absolute absurdity. And I slowly have accumulated some followers, and that has led to kind of where I am today, just in terms of I've kind of on Twitter, I've assumed this figurative role of being a pro bono attorney for civilization. And I know that might sound a little bit strange, but what I see is that civilization as such does not get much. We don't think about it as in those terms. And when I mean civilization, I mean in terms of the physicality of the systems that we have in place. And we don't see much, representation of civilization. And I've kind of assumed this pro bono attorney for civilization role, because on Twitter, you can kind of choose what you're doing. And I'll stop there.
No, that's great. Okay, so you talk about dealing with engineers and scientists. I don't think being engineer or scientist makes one left or right politically, but a lot of the energy space has been politicized, as we know, over time. I'm curious, as you network and engage with different, people in the arena that are dealing with the real logistics, when it comes to mining or the energy space more broadly. What's the kind of stuff that people say around each other, their friends, right? Do they basically say exactly what you just said? There's so much absurdity in the energy space, and here's the hardcore reasons for why we have to not think the way that we do. What's sort of the response to the politicization from those that are, again, in the arena?
Well, that's a really broad question. You have to be maybe more specific in terms of an industry, vertical. But I've been kind of criticized about being negative about like wind and solar and batteries. It's really just because those three ideas they are the poster child of absurdity to me. Like and basically anybody who understands material science and the mining industry and power systems, like power system engineers who do integration management, all of those people who don't say a lot. These are the practicing engineers. These are the people who are the white collar professionals. They don't really have much of a voice, and so the things that they talk about when it comes to like wind and solar integration, it's just an absurdity. So If you look at like Meredith Engwin's book, Shorting the Grid, I think she's probably got the strongest voice out there in terms of the kinds of things that people are saying and seeing, and why did people die in Texas when all of this, when the extreme weather events happened, those kinds of things. That's what I hear, and that's what I tweet about. I mean, and I have my Substack. I just put up an article the other day about, hey, how about a group of concerned systems engineers? Because I have system engineers. I had one. I quoted him in my article. He contacted me and he said, hey, we all kind of are worried about France and the deferred maintenance on their nuclear power fleet, but people in North America do not understand that the generation resources that are connected to fuel, so the dispatchable generation resources, they are being extraordinarily overutilized right now because there is so much wind and solar on the grid that we end up chasing those, resources. You just chase and chase and chase. And basically what he's saying is, I mean, this is just an example, but I just posted about it, and it's worrisome, right? He said that if you think France has a problem, we ain't seen nothing yet, because we can't get permission to do the normal maintenance on our major power plants because they are needed, because we don't have dispatchable energy resources. Our political system has, and Meredith covers this in her book, but we are on the path of France.
Let's talk about some of the unintended consequences of policy shifts when it comes to the energy space. I know you want to talk about some of the specifics, for example, around fractional distillation and sort of deindustrialization. It's even hard for me to say it. But talk about just some of the unintended consequences that you've seen with recent policy when it comes to gasoline, diesel, fuel in general.
No, and I don't know if it's unintended or not. I mean, certainly there are people who understand very well what's happening and how it works. But I think if you go to the service station and you notice how much gasoline costs versus diesel fuel, I mean, I don't think the average person knows what that's really about or what's happening. And I mean, I think I'll give you one absurdity that I think everyone can appreciate, and it kind of goes like this. So, what's the promise of the EV? So, you buy an EV. What is your intention when you buy the EV? It to save what? Gasoline, right? If I buy an EV, I can save the world from gasoline. I don't have to buy gasoline, and that's wonderful. But if you're looking at it in a vacuum, you don't appreciate all of the mining that goes into making the battery to free that vehicle, from we're trying to decouple from gasoline. Well, we ignore the mining. Well, mining consumes as much diesel fuel as the aviation industry. Well, diesel and jet fuel are the backbone of all of modern civilization because of the jet engine and because of the diesel engine. Those two engines are so efficient at doing work. And work, I mean work by like moving things around. I mean picking things up. Those two engines drive our entire civilization. And when you jack the mining industry up to make metals and minerals, you are consuming a lot of diesel fuel. Well, the problem is that with crude oil, we get our diesel fuel from crude oil. Crude oil, for every barrel of crude oil, you only get a little bit of diesel fuel. So if the mining industry goes to the petroleum industry and says, hey, I've got to double copper production in the next 10 years because the market's there, then the petroleum industry has to literally double the volume of crude oil that they produce to make double the diesel fuel that they make, right? I mean, I'm giving, I'm not trying to be quantitative. I'm not giving actual numbers, but this is just conceptual, right? So the point being that when we rely and we over rely on the mining industry and the construction industry to make things, that burns diesel fuel. Well, when we burn diesel fuel, a byproduct of diesel fuel distillation is gasoline. And a barrel of crude oil makes a lot more gasoline than it will make diesel fuel. And you can't turn gasoline into diesel fuel. It only goes one way. So diesel fuel is a major limiting factor in this whole concept of building stuff, electrify everything. It is a major limiting factor that people, I think the average person does not even begin to appreciate. And so I don't know if I was.
Yeah, no, but why is that? I mean, just given some of that narrative and some of those data points. I mean, is it just people are not good at the second order thinking of it, or is it that there's maybe some, I hate to say agenda, but there's a reason why people that's not being put out there as sort of a dynamic when it had batteries, right, and replacing fuel with EV.
Well, I think that you kind of look at things like everyone has their own self-interest, right? The mining industry is not complaining about doubling demand for copper. I mean, if you're a copper mine, aren't you happy that you have a market? I mean, you don't really care what it goes into. If you are big oil, do you care that you're going to have a bright future? You don't care. That's what you want, right? So why would you be speaking up about that? I just think that it's self-interest over somebody who's looking at the cause and effect, the big picture.
But presumably there's a point where that either the crowd wakes up to the reality or there's some kind of backlash, right? I mean, obviously you're probably still far away from that, but how do you even get to a point where people are just broadly more educated on this kind of stuff?
Well, and that's why I have a Substack, and I mean, I'm just contributing my free time. So take it for what it's for take my advice for what it's worth. But I see a great need for education, a great need for dialogue, a great need for better understanding of fundamental principles. But but your earlier question there is an answer to that, and it's just called inflation. So what will necessarily happen, and it's happening now, is that especially as governments subsidize things. I mean, governments, subsidize their preferred programs or their preferred infrastructure. It just like just as surely as night follows day, what happens? I mean, inflation. So, when there's major investment into the mining industry, then diesel fuel is going to go way up in value and gasoline goes down in value because, again, we're creating demand for diesel fuel, and that will necessarily make gasoline as a byproduct. So, I mean, the irony of the EV is if you scale it up, I mean, 16 states, all of Europe are going to this idea, this policy that says everyone has to have an EV. And what that's driving is, well, others have spoken more, eloquently and specifically than I have about the minerals that are required to support that kind of policy. But the reality is we're going to hit inflation square in the face. And the problem with diesel fuel especially is that, I mean, I don't know about you, but I like food. And all of our food comes from diesel fuel. In fact, you talk to any farmer and they will tell you that the direct diesel fuel costs for most farming operations is what, 40%, 50, 60% of their direct cost is diesel fuel. What happens when diesel fuel is $8, $10, $15 a gallon?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point. Let's go to some of the audience.
Well, so again, I am not giving anybody investment advice here, just to be clear. I mean, I'm not a market guy, but this is just kind of common sense, right? What happens when, right? So I think it's inevitable that inflation is going to break things. And what's going to break first? That's what I ask. What will break first when diesel fuel where I am is what, $6 a gallon? What happens when it hits $8 a gallon or $10 a gallon? What happens when gasoline goes down to $2 a gallon? People are going to use more of it. So, I mean, the irony of the EV is to produce the minerals to make the EV, the market will be flooded with what? A lot more gasoline. More gasoline and this is gasoline that would not exist but for the EV policy. So, I mean, that's why it's absurd. The absurdity is just, it gives me an aneurysm.
Speaking about absurdity, I think it's very clear that there's a degree of absurdity when it comes to the lack of nuclear or push for nuclear, not only as a sort of clean energy source and renewable, but also just to get us away from all kinds of other geopolitical risks where energy sources are coming from. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the state of the nuclear industry and if that is really as much of an ultimate solution as people would argue.
So, yeah, that's a nice softball for me because ultimately, I mean, my personal view of where we have to go as humanity, to save civilization, the only way that we can have a path forward without massive collapse and without economies turning into Cuba is to pivot hard to nuclear energy. And the reason being that all of these labels that we're fed, the renewable narrative, the renewable label, it's absurd. As applied to wind solar batteries, that's absurd. You can't, EV batteries are not recyclable. There is a treadmill that will have to make EV batteries forever in perpetuity because lithium, you can't recycle that. You can't recycle the battery. You can't recycle wind blades. You can't recycle a solar panel is not recyclable. That's nanotechnology. When it breaks, you have to build a new one from all fresh materials. So there's this treadmill that just the materiality of it is just not sustainable. So to call those things sustainable is an absurdity beyond absurdity. So the only thing that makes sense is we want energy. We have a need for thermal energy. Thermal energy is the most valuable energy that we have, that we can possibly make. And nuclear power makes 6 orders of magnitude more thermal energy than combustion. And I mean, I have a piece on my Substack, and I posted about this on Twitter, that from a fuel standpoint, 1 pound of uranium, it's a ball of 2.5 centimeter ball, 1 ball of uranium, that big, is enough thermal energy. If we could release it all, if we could fission all of that energy in a fast reactor, there's enough heat in that 1 pound of uranium to support the ridiculous energy consumption of the average North American for 100 years. So, put that in perspective.
Again, all this seems obvious. I don't know if it's a function of there aren't enough lobbyist dollars to kind of push for nuclear across the board, but what would it take to get, real government support for, broader nuclear across the US?
That is a good question. I have an article that I think it's probably my most popular article that I posted, and it's about this idea that nuclear power does not have a natural constituency because there's no money to be made for it. I mean, that 1 pound of uranium, the market value today is $48. There's no money to be made in that. There's no campaign contributions. There's no industry behind that can make profit. The market value for uranium for the last many years has been in the range of $25 a pound because that's how abundant it is, and that's the market. It's a commodity. It's a worldwide commodity, and it turns out there's a lot of uranium in the world. So at $25 a pound or $48 a pound, there's just not enough money in it. So what would it take? I think it's going to take common people like you and me and other people who educate themselves on the reality of the situation that we have to join together and create a constituency for the sake of civilization. I do this for the sake of my grandchildren. I've got 7 grandchildren. My wife and I have 9 children. I care about them. I care about their future. I'm going to be fine for the rest of my life, but I worry about my grandkids and their future.
I love that argument. It's around the sort of the efficiency. It's like if there's no money in it because there's so much you can get from a relatively small amount of uranium, right? So why push it when you already have entrenchments? I think it's an argument I hadn't heard before, but it makes a lot of sense. Let's go to some of the audience. Again, if anybody wants to come up, click on that bottom left mic request button. And those that are up, feel free to raise your hand anytime.
Oh, I totally agree. And let's talk about Fukushima for a minute. Fukushima Daiichi. So that's one of the most famous, that got so much press. But how many people know that Japan, there is a nuclear reactor that was much closer to the epicenter? The tsunami that hit the coast, it's right on the coast. The tsunami that hit the coast was much higher, much more powerful. It's the Onagawa reactor, and it was much closer, and it survived without a scratch. That entire reactor survived a 100-year, I don't know, 200-year tsunami earthquake. It was much closer to the epicenter, and it survived without a scratch. How many people know that? How many people know that Fukushima Daiichi, when they sited that reactor, the natural seawall at that location was 36 meters high? And the engineers, for whatever reason, human error, they literally cut that seawall down to 9 meters on purpose, because that was the design spec. I mean, they could not have imagined a wave that would be larger than 9 meters above whatever the grade was. So they literally cut down a natural 36-meter seawall, and actually, that to me, that's the root cause of the problem, or one. I think that is a major cause. How many people know that?
But you know why they don't know that? It's because it makes for poor drama, right? So
Right.
I would go back to it's the availability heuristic, right? People will think about some major news event, or they'll think of some blockbuster which is about the end of the world that might be caused because of some nuclear meltdown. I mean, even as you're talking, I'm literally I'm literally just, my subconscious is going back to, I think it was season 3 or season 4 of 24 with Kiefer Sutherland, when it was all about the nuclear football, and everything's going to get hacked and nuclear meltdowns are going to happen. So my point is that the reason I think a lot of this, to your point, is not known is because it doesn't make for good TV.
No, I agree with that. And then if you want to be a little more cynical, you can say that the natural constituencies that are against nuclear power have every reason to fan the flames and create the narratives that they want to create. And in fact, I've got an article on my Substack again. There is good evidence that in 2011, when Fukushima happened, that Gazprom itself literally saw a business opportunity like no other, and they executed it. And that business plan resulted in Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. It resulted in Germany literally wrecking 17 nuclear reactors. And the reason France is having so many problems is that French law in 2014 said, we are done with nuclear reactors and we're just going to run them into the ground. And so forget the maintenance, forget the upgrades, forget the reinvestment. We're just going to take the profits, the operating profits, because those reactors are extremely profitable. And we will just basically build wind, solar, and natural gas pipelines to Russia.
Do you get the sense that the Russia-Ukraine war is causing a change in sentiment among policymakers, that they realize they can't keep playing that game? I mean, Europe is the one that's, I think the area of the world that's most at risk, you can argue.
Yeah, I don't know so much about European politics, and I think Australia has the same kind of thing going on. But I think the common electorate, the common people, the business interests. I mean, what I can't understand about Germany is how complicit the entire industrial base is at being deindustrialized. I mean, apparently they don't care. They don't have enough political clout to change policies. And what for example, we have all this news about firm power contracts in Europe going for $500 or $600 or $700 a megawatt hour, like for next year. The German reactors, and Germany has 3 reactors that they've kind of put on standby now. Their cost to make electricity from those reactors is 20 euros a megawatt hour. And Germany is literally throwing them away. So what's really going on here? I mean, it's absurd. So I think that what's going to have to happen is enough people will have to be educated on objective reality to actually force political changes, because the current politicians are status quo. That's how we got here. So I think we need the time is right for a major political, and this has nothing to do with party politics. I mean, party politics is an absurdity too. This is just about objective reality.
For the remaining minutes here, please, everybody, make sure you follow BF Randall and check out his Substack, which really covers a lot of these topics very well. Again, this will be and edit a podcast under that Lead Lag Live banner. And if any of you want to come up, ask questions, engage, click on that bottom left mic request button and use the raise your hand function. Let's go to.
I really think it's going to take the business interests. I mean, even the mining industry is stressed, right? You look at the mining industry and they have to pass on their costs to consumers. And so everything inflates like crazy. I mean, it's not just the diesel fuel, it's the tires and everything else. So, every inflation is the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, again, an absurdity. I think it's going to take rational business leaders to step up. I mean, I see this in the petroleum industry. I mean, they are challenging the Biden administration on their policies, and rightly so. So I think it's going to take a broad-based coalition of business leaders who understand, and this has to be on the industrial side. This is not the Silicon Valley business leaders. This has to be industry, and they have to be the ones to carry this and fund it and figure it out, because the Silicon Valley idea is kind of how we got here, because I think that market is so divorced from industry in terms of just how things work, that I think that's part of the reason how we got here. Okay, those are all really good questions, and I'm going to kind of turn it on its head if you don't mind. So I did a decoupled podcast. It was my first podcast I've ever done, and if you look at the world energy consumption chart, which I put up there and I've talked about this in other articles, but you look at world energy consumption and what percentage of world energy consumption is electrical energy? It is literally it is 15%. So if you take every hydropower plant, every reactor, every single power plant, everything that exists on the planet, and you put it all in a basket, all of that energy is 15% of total energy. What is the other 85%? Well, that is really industry. That's industry making diesel fuel. That's industry making jet fuel. That's industry doing work. That's the mining industry. That is the logistics. That is bunker C fuel. That is propelling worldwide shipping. 85% is that energy. And so the promise of nuclear power is not even so much the electrical energy. That's only 15%. I mean, it is the most obvious thing in the world to say, at a minimum, we should be making 15% of our energy with nuclear power, because nothing makes better, more efficient electricity than nuclear power. But what about the 85%? Well, the 85% nuclear power, one of the best things, and this is what gets into the newer technology and like the natrium reactor and the fast neutron technology, and why I posted a very salty article this morning that some people are saying is too salty. I might have to go revisit it. But
nothing is too salty on Twitter. If you haven't at all, believe me.
So one of the things about nuclear power that again, I think this is an education thing, but most reactors that you think about, we think in our minds, we think of nuclear power as a power plant making electricity, and we're boiling water. We're making steam once through a steam turbine, and that's the nuclear reactor, and all that it's good for is to make electric energy. Well, it is, but there's just it's not the highest and best use of nuclear power, because if you can get out of the light water reactor technology, see, a light water reactor is we're using water to moderate the neutrons and slow them down. We're using really low enrichments. We're using 2, 3, 4% enrichments. And this is like we're trying to make belt and suspenders safety case. And so we're using water to slow down the energy of the neutrons to increase the chance of fission. So fast neutrons are the chance of causing another fission in a fast neutron fuel cycle is very low. So the fuel rods have to be very close together, and fast reactor technology does not. You don't want water in it, because every nuclear accident that you know about, like Fukushima and Chernobyl, those were all hydrogen explosions, because one of the downsides with water is that in a runaway reaction, there is spontaneous water, just spontaneously it decomposes into hydrogen and oxygen at a 2-to-1 ratio. And you know what happens when you put hydrogen and oxygen in the same space at a 2-to-1 ratio? You get a hydrogen explosion, not a hydrogen bomb. You get a conventional hydrogen explosion, which very energetic. So a hydrogen explosion is what blew up Chernobyl because, well, Chernobyl didn't even have containment. So that was like the worst of the worst. They had a graphite and a water moderated reactor that didn't even have containment. I mean, that's Chernobyl. And that could never happen again because every reactor on the planet has containment. But anyway, so light water reactor, the problem is you also have to reduce, you have the working fluid, if you will, is water. Well, water is a terrible working fluid to change heat because, for one thing, it goes through a phase change. It turns from water into steam, and it's high pressure. And so you have to reduce the operating temperature to about 250, 260, 260 C is kind of the operating temperature of a light water reactor. Well, that's kind of like putting a jet engine on a Volkswagen Bug with a 4-speed manual transmission. And so you're going to derate it down to like a 4-speed manual transmission because, otherwise it's not safe. Well, that's kind of ridiculous. And so, I mean, nuclear fission wants to actually safely operate more in the 500 C range. It's 500 C. And if you use a high temperature gas reactor, you're maybe getting up closer to 1000 C as an operating temperature. Well, if you go back to the 85%, that industry, the other energy that we need is process heat to do things. And if we apply 500 C or 800 C, 900 C to a process, we can actually supplant an enormous amount of the 85% with nuclear power process heat. And we don't need coal, and we don't need the 85%. We need some of it, but the highest and best use of nuclear power is really using high heat to go after the 85% instead of 250 C with steam to go after electric energy. The other nice thing is if you use high process heat in an industrial application, then you still get the steam. Like, you still get cogeneration. You can still boil water on the back end of that with the waste heat of that, and you can still make electricity out of it. So you get both. Anyway, sorry, I'll stop there.
Yeah, do you want to do any follow-up on those questions?
Right. So, I mean, part of what you're talking about is there are some really interesting utility, rate nuances when it comes to rooftop solar that kind of is not. Rooftop solar is kind of its own thing, and it's not really indicative of kind of grid costs. And so what's happening is because you have rooftop solar, and when I talk about PV panels being inefficient, I mean rooftop solar has a pretty decent argument because you're not trying to put that electricity on a grid. You're basically using it, where you consume it. So it's distributed. So rooftop solar has a better case. And what's happening, I think, in your situation is, I mean, 5 cents a kilowatt hour is not a normal tariff rate. That's not their actual cost to deliver power to you. And so one of the counter arguments about rooftop solar is there ends up being a lot of freeloading. So freeloading is if I put rooftop solar on my house, basically I don't have, because I only pay for what I take from the power company. I get 100%, because I have 100% backup and I'm not paying for it. I only pay for it when I need it, right? Like today is snowing where I am. Like I would have zero solar production. I would be 100% grid. But what would happen though is on a sunny day, I would be basically putting power back on the grid. So my actual rate, because I'm kind of my own power plant, is going to be different than, like a normal actual cost. So back to your question, I think if you look at actual nuclear power costs, and I posted about this. So Edgardo Sepulveda, I posted some of his stuff. If you look at Toronto, and I use that grid because they were able to get rid of all of their coal production. And what they're showing is their nuclear, and they have a lot of nuclear power. and their nuclear power is only slightly more than hydro, and I can't remember the exact number, but it's significantly lower than, well, it's lower than wind, and it's lower than other, it's way lower than solar. I think it's still above 5 cents. But getting back to my German example, the three nuclear reactors that Germany has, they make power for $20 or 20 euros a kilowatt hour. So that's 2 cents. So, I mean, if Germany would just turn it back on its reactors, how much better off would they be economically? So this idea that nuclear power is extraordinary, is extremely expensive, I think is just not true. The economics. So I think the most promising part about the economics is, again, this all remains to be seen, but GE Hitachi is about to, I think, really explode with their BWXT 300 reactor. And they have, their economics on that thing are, it's using 90% less structural concrete than the full scale reactor that they're pivoting their license off of the ESBWR, which is a 1400 megawatt reactor, 1200 megawatt. But they've learned the lessons of the AP1000, disaster that happened in Georgia and South Carolina. But the economics of that thing are, we're talking about a 3-year build that is a legitimate 3-year build. And we're talking about economics that are, of course, the cost of pipeline gas in the U.S., fluctuates, but economics are going to be the same, maybe better than dual combined cycle natural gas on pipeline gas, like from the United States, not LNG. One of the advantages of federalism is we have, this interesting governmental system. One of the disadvantages is that we have multiple levels of government that have different levels of control. So we have, on the one hand, we have like the NRC, which has exclusive licensing jurisdiction for nuclear reactors. And, they're going through a licensing process that they just have their own process. They also include site licensing. But the NRC is not, they're dispassionate in terms of local politics and so forth. They're just looking at it in terms of their own rules. And basically, it's the safety organization, right? State and local governments, several jurisdictions, several states, like California, there's a state statute that says nuclear power is illegal in California. So it just really depends on the jurisdiction you're talking about. The other nuance, utility law is so complicated. One of the problems, for example, with, like, we've all heard about the disaster of the AP1000, or if you're not familiar with it, the 4 big reactors that made Westinghouse go bankrupt and all of that drama. The reason for that was actually more of a financing choice than anything else, because the Public Service Committee, those were vertically integrated utilities. So Georgia Power, the utility in South Carolina, those were vertically integrated utilities, meaning that the Public Service Commission approved those projects inside the rate base. So they were financed inside the rate base, and ratepayers they were basically forced partners on those projects. Well, the problem for the ratepayers was that the AP1000 was a first of a kind reactor. And the risks of a first of a kind reactor are, or any project, any energy tech, right? The risk of a first of a kind are significant. And I think, Westinghouse really pulled a fast one on the Public Service Commission here, because if you're in the energy development business and you can get a utility to back up your first of a kind, and they take all the risk, or a substantial part of the risk, and once you approve the first of a kind, if that had worked out, Westinghouse would have had a cash cow that they don't have to share their profits with anybody else after they proved it. So if they had built those plants, I think Westinghouse should have been forced to build those plants, the first ones, as merchant plants. A merchant plant is just independently financed. It is simply on the market. It's selling power into the grid on a contract basis, and it is self-financed. So our utility markets are really strange in terms of, there's just this mix of public power. There's a mix. TVA is this federalized power entity that does a lot of, and they're building their own fleet now of the X300 reactors. I mean, I think TVA and Darlington up in Canada are really going to lead the way on commercialization of the X300. But no, so sorry. So back to your question about giving utilities a cut. I mean, it's not that simplistic. It doesn't really work that way. It's much more complicated in terms of how they come to be, because everyone is a custom suit.
And maybe for the remaining few minutes here, again, since we're wrapping up in 5, everybody, again, please make sure you follow BF Randall, check out his Substack as well. We'll go for the last one and we'll wrap up here.
Well, I think ESG leads to all kinds of market warping results that, I mean, I have a fantasy of creating my own like anti-ESG movement where, hey, I'll put together investments that actually make sense in the real world, and they're going to be the polar opposite of ESG. But no, ESG, I think, is one of the absurdities, because the people who bless, the investments are just unbelievably naive, unbelievably, I don't know the word to say. I mean, they understand objective reality of how things work. So I think, again, it's an absurdity. I do see some big funds bailing out of the ESG movement, which is, to me, the sooner that happens, the better, because I think that movement, as applied to industrial investments, is an absurdity. And it is not in our best interest to follow that kind of rationale.
Yeah, I think the idealist point is, I think, spot on that. Again, everybody, this will be a podcast on the Lead Lag live banner. BF's been kind enough to join and really impart some great knowledge here. Any final thoughts, BF, that you want to leave the audience with before we end this space?
No, I really appreciated that. Please follow me. Again, I'm just kind of doing this in my spare time, so I think this is worthy of this. Supporting nuclear power is worthy of our best efforts collectively. It is not going to happen on its own. There is no natural constituency, but there are many beneficiaries if we can make it happen. And I think it's inevitable. Nuclear power is inevitable. It's just how much pain do we have to face before we finally realize that.
Well, thank you.